In the early 1960s, where neon lights still flickered like restless stars over Hollywood Boulevard and the night belonged to singers, dreamers, and men chasing something they couldn't name, Dean Martin had already become a living atmosphere rather than just a person. Wherever he went, laughter softened, conversations leaned closer, and music seemed to breathe a little easier. But behind the polished smile and the effortless charm was a man who had learned. Through a life of quiet bruises and private battles, that dignity was not something you defended with fists or headlines, but with the steady refusal to become smaller when the world tried to shrink you. That belief had followed him from smoky Ohio clubs to the biggest stages in America. And on a certain rain-washed night in Los Angeles, it would be tested in a way no audience ever saw coming. The club was called the Orion Room, a fashionable new venue carved into the heart of Sunset Strip, built on the promise of exclusivity. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight. A jazz trio drifted through the room like smoke. Waiters moved as if they were part of the choreography. It was the kind of place where money whispered instead of talked, where deals were made in raised eyebrows, and where reputations were currency. The owner, Victor Hale, had risen too quickly. Some said from a minor promoter to a man who now controlled stages, contracts, and careers. His success came wrapped in silk suits and newspaper praise. But behind closed doors, people spoke of his temper, his hunger for control, and his habit of reminding even legends that every microphone had a switch someone else owned. Dean hadn't planned to come that night. He had just finished a long recording session and intended to go home, pour himself a quiet drink, and sit with the kind of silence that only exhaustion earns. But a young pianist, he'd recently met a nervous kid with more talent than confidence, had begged him to stop by. The boy had gotten his first real booking, opening for a small act at the Orion Room, and the fear in his voice had been unmistakable. Dean knew that fear. He remembered it from years earlier, from back rooms and cheap stages, from nights when applause felt like mercy instead of reward. So he agreed, pulled on a coat, and went. When Dean entered, the room didn't erupt. It never did. His presence didn't need spectacle. It spread. Heads turned slowly. Conversations thinned. Somewhere near the stage, the pianist looked up, saw him, and visibly forgot how to breathe. Dean lifted 2 fingers in a casual salute, the smallest encouragement, but it landed like a hand on the shoulder. The boy straightened. His playing steadied. The music found its spine again. Dean took a seat near the back, not wanting to be the show, just wanting to witness it. A waitress brought him a drink without asking. He nodded his thanks. He was content to disappear into the sound. That was when Victor Hale approached. Victor was a tall man with carefully neutral features, the kind that revealed nothing unless he wanted them to. His smile was professional, not warm, and his eyes flicked not to Dean's face, but to the reactions around him, measuring the subtle shifts in attention like numbers on a ledger. "Mr. Martin," he said, extending a hand. "An honor." Dean stood, shook it once, and sat back down. "Nice place you've got here." Victor smiled wider. "We try to keep standards." They spoke briefly, politely about music, about the city, about how difficult it had become to impress an audience that thought it had seen everything. Then Victor's tone changed, not sharply, but deliberately, the way a door closes when you don't notice the wind. "I was hoping," he said, "you might consider stepping on stage tonight, unannounced, just one number. The room would lose its mind." Dean tilted his head. "It's the kids' night. Let him have it." Victor chuckled softly. "People don't come here for kids. They come for names." Dean studied him for a moment, then shook his head once. "Not tonight." The smile remained, but something tightened behind it. "Of course," Victor said. Another time, turned to leave, then stopped. "By the way," he added casually, "your table's on the house. But company policy says all guests need to clear their tabs by the end of the night. No exceptions. We've had misunderstandings before." Dean's brows drew together slightly. "I always pay my way." Victor met his eyes now. "I'm sure you do." He walked off. It was nothing. Less than nothing. And yet something in the air had shifted. Like a note played just slightly off key. The pianist finished his set to sincere applause. Dean was the first to stand. The boy looked out into the crowd and saw him clapping, saw him smiling, and for a second the entire room dissolved. Later, he would say that was the moment he became a musician. Dean ordered another drink. The jazz trio returned. Laughter rose. Glasses chimed. Then a disturbance rippled near the bar, too. Waiters were speaking urgently to an older black man in a gray suit, regular. By the look of him, someone who belonged to the furniture of the place. The man's voice was calm but strained. People nearby leaned back in their chairs. Victor Hale appeared again, this time without a smile. Dean watched as Victor gestured toward the door. "I've been coming here since you opened," the man said. "I paid already." Victor shook his head. "There's been a mistake. I have the receipt." Victor didn't look at it. "Then you can sort it out tomorrow. Right now you're disrupting my room. I'm sitting quietly." Victor's voice hardened. "Not anymore." One of the waiters reached for the man's elbow. Dean stood before he was aware of deciding to. He crossed the room at an unhurried pace. Not dramatic. Not confrontational. Simply present? "Everything all right?" he asked. Victor turned, surprised. "Yes, Mr. Martin. We're handling a small issue." Lean looked at the older man. "Sir?" The man straightened. "They're saying I didn't pay." Dean turned back to Victor. "He says he did." Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "This isn't your concern." Dean's voice remained gentle. "If a man's being asked to leave, it's a concern." The surrounding tables had gone silent now, not in anticipation, but in that uneasy way that comes when people sense a line approaching. Victor gestured again toward the door. "He can discuss it with management later." Dean shook his head once. "Why later?" "Takes a minute to check." Victor's eyes flashed. "This is my establishment, and he's my neighbor for the evening," Dean replied. "Seems we both have an interest." For a long moment, neither spoke. The jazz trio had stopped playing, unsure when. The only sound was glass settling on tabletops. Victor exhaled through his nose. "Fine, but this table—" He nodded. "Toward Dean's seat is reserved for guests who respect how we run things." Dean followed the gesture back to his table, to the drink waiting for him, to the space he'd occupied without thinking. He understood then. The invitation. The comment about tabs. The sudden urgency. It wasn't about money. It was about control. He looked back at Victor. "If the price of sitting there is pretending not to see what's happening here," he said quietly, "then it's too expensive." Victor's lips parted in disbelief. "You're choosing him over my house?" Dean didn't answer immediately. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and removed several bills. He placed them gently into the older man's hand. "For your evening," he said. "And the next few?" The man stared at the money, then at Dean, eyes shining with something dangerously close to tears. Victor's face darkened. "You're out of line." Dean finally met his gaze fully. "Then draw it again somewhere else." He turned, went back to his table, picked up his coat, and set a few bills beneath his untouched glass. "For the drink," he said to the waitress, who hadn't moved since the argument began. Then he walked back to the older man, placed a hand lightly on his back, and together they headed toward the exit. Behind them, Victor's voice cut through the room. "Don't bother coming back, Mr. Martin."
Oh.
Dean stopped at the door. He didn't turn around right away. When he did, his expression was not angry. It was almost kind. "That's all right," he said. "I don't go where respect has to be negotiated." He opened the door. Cool night air rushed in. The neon lights bled into the wet pavement. The music did not resume. Outside, under the awning, the older man finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that." Dean smiled faintly. "That's usually how you know you should." The door closed behind them. Inside, Victor Hale stood in the center of his perfect room, surrounded by people who suddenly felt less impressed by it. And somewhere in the city, a rumor had just been born, soft at first, almost harmless, but carrying with it the beginning of a story no amount of velvet rope could contain. The story of what happened at the Orion Room did not explode. spread. It moved the way smoke does through a building long before anyone smells fire slipping under doors. Clinging to coats, riding home in the back of conversations. By morning, the details were already shifting. By afternoon, they were sharpening. By nightfall, the industry had done what it always did. It had chosen a version that made power comfortable. In that version, Dean Martin had caused a scene. A promising club owner had been disrespected. In that version, a business had been threatened. And in every version that mattered to the men who controlled stages and schedules, Dean Martin had become difficult. He did not read the papers. He never did. But he heard the tone in voices. He felt the pauses where warmth used to be. The first call came from an agent he had known for years. A man who had once told him that Hollywood survived not on talent but on alignment. The man spoke lightly, almost apologetically. But the message underneath the softness was sharp. 2 appearances had been delayed. A television guest spot had been reconsidered. A benefit concert had gone in another direction. No one accused Dean of anything. No one confronted him. They simply stopped reaching for him first. And in a town built on invitations, that absence was a language of its own. Dean hung up, stood in his kitchen for a long moment, and listened to the quiet. He could have fixed it with a sentence. A call. A public shrug. A carefully placed laugh about misunderstandings and moods. He understood the mechanics of forgiveness in Hollywood. It was rarely about right or wrong. It was about convenience. All he had to do was make himself convenient again. He poured coffee instead by the 3rd day. The ripple had reached the lower floors of the industry, where consequences lived more visibly. The pianist from the Orion room called, voice shaking, to say his next booking had vanished. No explanation. Just a polite email about restructuring. Dean listened without interrupting, then apologized not because he believed he had done wrong, but because he knew how heavy it felt when the cost of someone else's integrity landed on your doorstep. "I never asked you to speak," the boy said quickly. "I just wanted you there." Dean closed his eyes. "I know." That afternoon, Dean drove alone along the coast, the radio low, the ocean gray and endless to his right. He had taken this road many times when life began to press inward. When the noise of being known became louder than the sound of being alive, he remembered another road decades earlier, back when his name had still been a gamble, when clubs paid him in meals and hope. Back then, men like Victor Hale existed too. They just wore cheaper suits. They crossed lines quietly. They decided who could stay and who must leave. And most people, good people, had looked away, because survival often disguises itself as practicality. Dean had promised himself. He would never confuse the two at a red light. He noticed a black sedan idling behind him longer than necessary. It followed when he turned. It followed again after the light. Not aggressively, not threateningly, just there. When he pulled into a small seaside diner he liked, the car continued past, slow, deliberate, as if to be seen. Inside the diner, the waitress recognized him immediately, but her smile was nervous. She seated him near the window and lingered longer than usual while pouring his coffee. "People have been calling," she said softly, without being asked. "Asking if you still come here." "And what did you tell them?" She hesitated. "That you're just a man who likes pie?" He smiled. "Then you told the truth." She smiled back, relieved. But her eyes held the question she didn't speak. What happens when the world decides you're more than that? It happened faster than he expected. 2 nights later, a charity gala quietly removed his name from its promotional material. No announcement, just absence. A producer he'd known since the early days sent a bottle of wine with a note that said nothing more than he didn't have to make it public. Dean read it twice, set it aside, and wondered when decency had begun to count as spectacle. The pressure did not come as force. It came as suggestion. One evening, his longtime manager, Lou, sat across from him in his living room, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles had lost their color. Lou had been with him through peaks and falls, through eras when success felt like a wave, and eras when it felt like a memory. If anyone could speak freely, it was him. "They're not done," Lou said carefully. "Victor's been talking. He's not angry. That's the problem. He's strategic. Dean leaned back. What does he want? Lou exhaled. A picture? You, him, a handshake. Maybe a small benefit event. Something that says whatever happened was small, and now it's over. And the man? Dean asked. The one they tried to put out? Lou's mouth opened, then closed again. No one's talking about him. Dean nodded slowly. That's usually how you know who matters. Lou rubbed his face. You don't understand. This isn't about pride. This is about access. They can make rooms smaller. They can make stages disappear. They can, Dean agreed. Silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of years and the fear of losing what those years had built. Finally, Lou said, almost pleading, you've paid enough in your life. You don't have to pay again. Dean's gaze drifted to the framed photograph on the wall across from them, himself much younger. Arm around Sammy, around Frank, all of them laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. He thought of men who had been turned into names before they were allowed to be people. He thought of the older man's hand in his own, steady and surprised. He thought of the pianist's face when the applause had risen. Some prices, he said quietly, aren't punishments. They're receipts. Lou closed his eyes. The first real blow landed a week later. Dean arrived at a mid-sized theater in Pasadena, where he was scheduled to perform a small, semi-private show, nothing glamorous. Just music, conversation, an evening built on closeness rather than spectacle. The house was half-lit when he walked in. Technicians moved slowly, deliberately. No one met his eye. A young coordinator approached him, her clipboard pressed to her chest like armor. Mr. Martin, she said, voice tight, there's been a change. He waited. The venue owner has decided to go in another direction. With what? Dean asked gently. With the night, she swallowed. They're canceling. Dean glanced around the room, the half-set stage. The empty chairs waiting to be filled, the microphone already adjusted to his height. Why? She hesitated, then looked up, something raw in her expression. They were told to? By who? Her eyes flicked toward the door, then back. People who can. Dean nodded once. All right. That was it. No argument. No call to lawyers. No demand for explanation. He turned, thanked her for her time, and walked back into the daylight, as if a door had not just closed on months of preparation and dozens of people's work. Outside, the air felt brighter than it should have. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching a stagehand coil a cable through a loading bay, watching life continue to arrange itself without regard for anyone's disappointment. Then he heard his name. A man in his 40s stood a few feet away, holding a small, folded program. He looked uncertain, like someone who wasn't sure whether he was allowed to speak to what he admired. I drove 2 hours, the man said. They told us it was canceled. Dean studied him. I'm sorry. The man hesitated, then held out the program. Would you still sign it? Dean took it. He asked his name. They spoke briefly about the drive, about the weather, about how the man's father had played Dean's records on Sundays. Dean signed the program slowly, carefully, as if the act itself mattered. The man's voice shook. My dad passed last year. He would have loved tonight. Dean handed the program back. Then he did something he had not planned to do. There's a coffee shop down the street, he said. If you've come this far, maybe we don't waste the evening. The man stared. Just coffee, Dean smiled. Just by the time they arrived, 3 more people had recognized him and followed at a distance, unsure. Someone took a seat. Someone else asked if it was all right to listen. Within 20 minutes, half the shop was filled not with fans, not with cameras, but with people who had been told there would be nothing and found something instead. Dean did not sing at first. He listened. He asked names. He heard stories. He let the room become a room again when he finally did sing. It was without amplification, his voice low, unguarded, carrying not across the theater, but across a few small tables and into the spaces where ordinary nights live. No one recorded it, no one sold it, and no one forgot. What Dean did not know was that someone had been watching from across the street, seated in the same black sedan, a man sent not to threaten, but to measure, to see whether isolation had worked, to see whether the price was becoming visible. And as Martin's voice drifted through the open door of a nameless coffee shop instead of a famous hall. That man realized something that Victor Hale would not understand until it was far too late. Some men grow smaller when you close doors. Others become doorways, and the industry had just begun to learn. Kind Dean Martin was. By the time Dean Martin realized the situation had moved beyond rumors and closed doors, the industry had already rearranged itself around the idea that he was supposed to disappear quietly. It was not said aloud. It was implied. A producer who once called every week now took days to reply. A venue that had begged for his presence sent a formal note about schedule conflicts. Even friends began choosing their words more carefully, as if speaking to him too openly might mark them. Hollywood had many languages. Silence was its most dangerous. But silence had never frightened Dean as much as distortion. It came to him through an unlikely source. The older man from the Orion room. His name was Elijah Brooks. Dean had not sought him out. He believed, perhaps naively, that the kindness of that night should be allowed to stand without obligation. But Elijah found him anyway. Through a mutual friend who worked sound at small venues and still believed introductions were bridges rather than transactions, Elijah called and asked if they could speak. Not about gratitude. About something else, they met in a quiet public park on the edge of the city, where palm trees stood like sentinels and the noise of traffic faded into something almost human. Elijah was neatly dressed, his posture dignified, but the ease Dean remembered was gone. He seemed to carry something under his skin that did not belong to him. "I didn't tell you everything that night," Elijah said once they were seated on a bench facing a drained fountain. "I didn't think it was right, but things have changed." Dean waited. Elijah Brooks, the man continued, used to be a bookkeeper for small clubs, then for bigger ones, then for men who didn't like their names attached to anything that could be audited. Dean's gaze sharpened. "Victor Hale was one of them," Elijah said. "I worked for him before he had the Orion room, before the polish, before the articles. I kept numbers, real ones. I left when the numbers stopped adding up to just money." Dean felt the air shift around them, like a storm beginning somewhere out at sea. "He recognized me that night," Elijah said quietly. "That's why it happened. Not because of a tab. Because he thought I had come back for something and had you." Dean asked. Elijah shook his head. "I hadn't thought about him in years. But after that night, people started coming to my apartment. Men who didn't introduce themselves. They asked questions about you. About whether I'd spoken to you before. About whether I'd given you anything." Dean's jaw tightened. "Given me what?" Elijah reached into his inner pocket, hesitated, then withdrew a small, sealed envelope. It looked ordinary. Too ordinary. "I didn't give this to you," he said, "because I didn't know if I should. Because I didn't want to drag you into something you never asked for. But they think I did. And if they think that, then you're already standing where I'm standing." He held the envelope out between them. Dean did not take it immediately. He studied Elijah's face instead. "What is it?" "Copies," Elijah said. "Of books Victor thought were gone. Names, transfers, clubs that were never supposed to be profitable but somehow kept expanding. People who own nothing on paper and everything in practice. And why bring it to me?" Dean asked. Elijah met his eyes. Because when a man is willing to lose what protects him in public, he is often the only kind of man who can protect something in private. The words settled heavily between them. Dean reached out and took the envelope. He did not open it there. He did not ask further questions. He did not promise anything. But he understood in that moment that the Orion room had not been a boundary crossed in a single night. It had been a fault line, and pressure had finally found it. What neither of them saw was the man watching from across the park, pretending to feed pigeons he did not look at, his phone dark in his palm. His gaze fixed not on Elijah, but on Dean. That evening, Dean drove home along roads that no longer felt neutral. Every light behind him seemed to linger. Every parked car seemed more deliberate. It was not fear he felt. It was recognition. He had known men who operated in this shadowed arithmetic before men, who believed consequence was something that happened to other people at home. He poured himself a drink he did not touch and sat at the table with the envelope in front of him like a quiet. Accusation inside were ledgers, photocopied pages, handwritten notes, dates that reached back further than Victor's public success, names that appeared again and again across different ventures, like signatures disguised as coincidence. There were amounts too precise to be random and too misplaced to be honest. There were references to rooms, to partners, to facilitation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would thrill a newspaper, but enough to show that the Orion room was not a business, it was a surface. The phone rang. Dean did not answer it at first. He waited. Let it ring. Let it stop. Then it rang again, when he finally picked up. Victor Hale's voice greeted him as if weeks of distance had never existed. "Dean," Victor said warmly, "I was beginning to think you'd changed your number." Dean asked, a small pause. "I want to clear the air." "There is no air between us," Dean replied. "Only space." Victor chuckled. "You always had a way with words. Listen, this thing has gotten larger than it needed to be. People misinterpreted. Lines were drawn that no one meant to draw." Dean's eyes went to the envelope. "Some lines draw themselves, which is why I think it's time we were seen together," Victor said smoothly. "At dinner. Quiet. No press. Just two men correcting a story before it becomes something neither of us recognizes. And if I don't?" Dean asked. Another pause. "Longer this time. Then the story keeps being told without you," Victor said. "And you know how that usually ends." Dean leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking softly under his weight. "You called to threaten me?" Victor laughed. "I called to protect you." Dean closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of Elijah's apartment, of men without names, of venues that vanished from calendars, of young performers whose chances could be erased by a phone call they would never hear. "You should stop," Dean said quietly. "Stop what?" "Thinking the world only happens where you point," Dean replied. The warmth drained from Victor's voice. "You don't know what you're holding." "I know exactly what I'm holding," Dean said. "And it's heavier than you think." Silence. Then Victor spoke and the silk was gone. "You sing," he said. People smile. "You don't belong in rooms where numbers are kept." Dean's reply was soft. "Then you shouldn't have brought the numbers to me." He hung up that night. Elijah Brooks' apartment was broken into. Nothing was taken. Everything was disturbed. Chairs overturned. Papers scattered. Drawers emptied and left open like mouths that had tried to speak. The message was not theft. It was reached Elijah called Dean just after midnight, his voice steady in the way only men who have already crossed into clarity can manage. "They were here," he said. "They didn't find what they wanted, but they wanted me to know they could." "Where are you now?" Dean asked. "Not there," Dean said. "Stay that way." When the call ended, Dean did not go to bed. He sat until the sky began to thin at the edges, and the city softened into that brief hour where even the most ruthless places pretend to rest. He thought of all the rooms he had stood in where applause had risen like forgiveness. He thought of all the doors that had opened because he had learned how to be agreeable. He thought of how easy it would be to step back now, to place the envelope somewhere safe and pretend he had never been handed anything heavier than a microphone. And he thought of the older man's quiet dignity, of the pianists shaking hands, of the coffee shop where a canceled night had become a real one. Power had reached too far, and when it did, it revealed something it had not meant to show. It was afraid of a man who would not trade his place for his peace. Dean stood, carried the envelope into his study, and opened a drawer that had not been used in years. Inside were old contacts, names that did not belong to clubs, people who did not need stages to matter, people who understood records and silence and the difference between rumor and evidence. He began to write. not a song, a list. And somewhere across the city, Victor Hale sat in a glass office above a room full of music he no longer heard, looking at his phone, waiting for confirmation that his reach was still longer than anyone else's courage. He did not yet know that the longest thing Dean Martin had ever built was not a career. It was a line, and once crossed, it did not disappear. The morning the story finally broke, it did not arrive with headlines. It arrived with absence. A nationally syndicated radio program that had teased a Dean Martin appearance replaced his slot with music and an apology about unexpected changes. A charity telecast quietly restructured its lineup overnight. A Las Vegas showroom removed his name from its marquee before sunrise. No scandal. No explanation. Just coordinated disappearance. To anyone watching casually, it looked like a season passing. To anyone who understood the industry, it looked like a decision Victor Hale had not tried to win. He had tried to erase, but erasure is only possible when everyone agrees to look away. And what Victor could not see from the height of his office was the slow, dangerous accumulation of people who had learned how to look closer. Dean did not protest. He did not call reporters. He did not make speeches. He met instead with men and women whose professions were built on patience rather than applause. Accountants who specialized in forensic trails, attorneys who worked in rooms without windows, a retired city auditor who no longer feared being uninvited anywhere. He gave them nothing dramatic. He gave them copies, names, dates, and a story that had begun not with revenge, but with a man being asked to leave a room he had already paid to enter. Elijah Brooks stayed nowhere more than 2 nights in a row. Dean arranged it quietly, through friends whose loyalty predated success. Elijah never complained, but the strain showed in the way he held his shoulders, in the way he checked doorways before stepping through them. One evening, as they sat in a borrowed apartment, overlooking a stretch of dark freeway, Elijah finally asked the question he had been carrying since the park. "Why are you really doing this?" He said, "You could still step away. Say you never saw any of it. They'd let you back in." Dean looked at the city lights, scattered like a fallen constellation. "I know," he said. "Then why not?" Dean took a long moment before answering. "Because when a door closes on someone for reasons that don't belong to them," he said quietly, "it closes a little on everyone who walks past it pretending not to hear." Elijah lowered his eyes. The investigation did not move like a chase. It moved like winter. Slowly, invisibly, inevitably. Financial patterns that had once seemed like coincidences were laid over one another and began to resemble architecture. Shell companies pointed toward, holding groups that pointed toward rooms that had never existed on any public plan. Clubs that lost money somehow paid for renovations. Promoters who failed upward left trails no one had followed, because success itself had been treated as explanation. 3 weeks after Dean had first received the envelope, a city zoning board quietly froze the licenses for 2 venues Victor had partial interest in. A week later, a bank placed temporary holds on several accounts pending routine review. Then, a junior reporter at a local business paper asked a question that did not get printed but did get repeated. "Why does a nightclub need so many consulting firms?" Victor called Dean again. This time, there was no warmth. "You gave something to someone," Victor said. Dean did not deny it. "I gave time to people who knew how to use it." "You think this ends well?" Victor said. "It never ends. It only moves." "Then it's your turn to feel it move," Dean replied. The next day, Elijah Brooks was detained for questioning on an unrelated matter, an administrative tangle from years earlier. Small, technical, perfectly chosen to unsettle. Dean arrived at the municipal building before anyone called him. He sat on a hard bench outside an office that smelled of paper and disinfectant. His presence both ordinary and impossible to ignore. People noticed. Someone whispered. Someone else took a photograph and then thought better of it and deleted it. After 2 hours, Elijah emerged, released without charge, but shaken. Dean stood. They did not speak. They did not need to. The message had been delivered in both directions. The turning point came not from Hollywood. but from a woman named Ruth Calder, a senior accountant at a private investment firm who had once audited a hospitality group that no longer existed on paper. She requested a meeting with the attorneys Dean had connected with. She brought one folder, then another, then 5 more. Her hands trembled only once, when she admitted she had been warned years earlier that asking certain questions made people professionally difficult. Within days, those folders became subpoenas, and subpoenas, unlike rumors, arrive with weight. City inspectors appeared at the Orion Room unannounced, measuring, reviewing, documenting fire safety, employment records, renovation permits, health compliance. It was not a raid. It was worse. It was method. Each visit revealed something small enough to be dismissed and too frequent to be accidental. Then a regional bank filed a suspicious activity report. That could not be unsent. Then a former partner, long silent, requested immunity. The industry began to feel it. Contracts hesitated. Backers delayed. A man who had once controlled rooms now found himself waiting outside them. Victor Hale still wore good suits. He still smiled. But the smile had acquired an edge. The kind that appears when reflection becomes unavoidable. He requested a meeting, not by phone, by letter. Dean read it twice, folded it once, and did not answer. The public moment when it finally came was not explosive. It was procedural. A city council session about licensing included an unexpected agenda item. A representative from the Financial Crimes Division presented findings. The name Victor Hale was not the headline. It was the paragraph, but paragraphs are what dismantle empires. Within 48 hours, multiple business entities were placed under formal review. A week later, one of Victor's managing partners resigned. 2 days after that, a subpoena bearing his name was delivered to an office where the windows were designed to impress. Victor called. Again, Dean let it ring. Then the phone rang a second time, and a third. On the fourth, Dean answered. "You could stop this," Victor said. "You could still say this started as a misunderstanding." Dean's voice was calm. "It started as a man being asked to leave a room for existing. That's not what this is about anymore," Victor said sharply. "No," Dean replied. "Now it's about what you've built on the assumption that no one would ever refuse you." Silence. When Victor spoke again, something had broken through. "You don't belong in this," he said. "You don't know what it costs." Dean looked around his home at photographs that did not care about relevance, at records that did not ask permission to be played. "I know exactly what it costs," he said. "That's why I didn't negotiate the first time." He hung up. The formal announcement came on a Friday afternoon. It was carefully worded and broadly scoped. Investigations, financial irregularities, review of operations, cooperation with authorities. Victor Hale was not named in the opening paragraph, but he was named the Orion. Room closed temporarily that night, and something else opened. It happened quietly, as most real shifts do. Venues that had distanced themselves began to call again, not with apologies, but with something closer to humility. Performers who had lost bookings were rebooked. The pianist from the first night received an unexpected invitation from a respected jazz hall that had never returned his emails before. A small article ran in a local paper, not about Dean Martin's disappearance, but about a canceled show that had turned into an unplanned gathering, and the singer who had refused to let the night be wasted. No accusations, no spectacle, just context. Dean did not reclaim stages. Stages found him. Months later, Dean was invited to perform at a benefit supporting independent musicians. It was held not in a grand hall, but in a renovated civic auditorium that smelled faintly of fresh paint and optimism. Backstage, as he adjusted his cuff, a young usher approached. "Nervous, Mr. Martin," he said. "There's someone who wants to thank you." Dean stepped into the hallway. The older man from the Orion Room stood there. So did the pianist. And behind them, several others, a waitress from the coffee shop, a sound technician who had lost work and found it again, a woman from the zoning board who who had risked being inconvenient. Ruth called her holding a program in both hands as if it were proof that something real could still be scheduled. They did not speak it. Once they simply stood. Dean felt something unfamiliar rise behind his eyes. Elijah stepped forward. "You didn't save us," he said. "You stood where we could finally see each other." Dean shook his head. "I just didn't move." When Dean walked onto the stage that night, there was applause. Real applause. Not thunder. Not frenzy. The kind that comes from recognition rather than excitement. He stood at the microphone, looked out over a room that had been built, not on power, but on presence. And for a moment, he did not sing. Instead, he said, "There are a lot of ways to pay in this life. Some cost you money. Some cost you comfort. And some cost you the ability to sleep without explaining yourself. If you're lucky, you only ever pay the first two. If you're brave, you choose the third." Then he sang. And in the room that could not silence him, people did not feel entertained. They felt steadied. Somewhere else in the city. Behind a desk no longer surrounded by certainty, Victor Hale read documents that did not care who he had once been. The room he had built had failed him. The rooms Dean had walked into had not, because power had rooms, but dignity has doors, and Dean. Martin had spent a lifetime learning which ones were worth opening, and which ones were worth standing in front of when someone else was told to leave.